think so.
Okay. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today, or this evening, braving the Kansas weather, whatever it may bring, for our first in the series of discussions and topics for the STEAM. Thanks to Kansas. Make sure I almost said Kansas Humanities Council again. Humanities Kansas for their generous grant in allowing us to do this tonight and our future talks. So first up, opening our discussion for tonight, is a presentation by Dr. Jim Okapal, and who, his bio here, grew up in a small town in northwest Ohio, or attending Ohio State University, where he earned his BA in philosophy with a minors in political science and English in 1993. From there, he earned his MA in philosophy at Bowling Green State University and his PhD in philosophy at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. After a brief stint at Southern Methodist University, he joined the faculty at Missouri Western in 2005. Since then, he served as a member of the Mosaic Healthcare Systems Ethics Committee, area chair of philosophy and culture at the Pop Culture Association National Conference, and is currently chair of both Department of Philosophy and Religion and Department of History and Geography at Missouri Western State University. Dr. Okapal's research focuses on the intersection of ethics and literature. He has presented and published over a dozen articles in this area, focusing primarily on science fiction and fantasy literature. He is currently an editor for McFarland Publishing's Ethics and Culture series, and is working on a volume entitled Ethics in Science Fiction. So, join me in giving a warm welcome to James Okapal.
Well, thank you, Mike. I also want to say thanks to Stacy for the two of you for inviting me to come and help you guys open this series. So one of the things I was told is that this was a series that is going to focus especially on not just the humanities, but issues of social justice too. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit later after I give my talk. So I wanted to put together a talk that kind of dealt with the intersection of science, social justice, and then how the humanities can help us out with that. So who recognizes this quote, right? But you scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could that they didn't stop to think if they should. Everybody recognize that? Right? Very famous movie quote. That's Dr. Ian Malcolm, right? Otherwise known as the actor's name. Jeff Goldblum, right, from Jurassic Park, right, that you're messing around doing things with science that maybe you shouldn't say, right? But then there's also this very famous quote from J. Robert Oppenheimer, right after the first atomic bomb was detonated. He quoted from Indian philosophy this line, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds," where he immediately recognized that what he had done in the service of the United States during World War II was problematic from a social and ethical standpoint. And so what both of these quotes are getting at, to some extent, is this notion that ethics is not devoid of value, which is not something that people have believed throughout the 20th century. It is a view that is much more prominent now. And so what we need to start talking about, and I think what the series is supposed to be getting into, is, well, what are some of those values, right? How do they intersect with science? How can the humanities, right, who mostly talks about values over the sciences, start dealing with this? So this isn't really a thesis for what I'm going to talk about. This is more of a belief that I have that programs like this, I think, are going to help out with. And what I believe is that the humanities and the sciences together can improve the conditions of social justice. That it's working together where that can happen. Science and technology can make our lives better. They can also make current social situations worse if we're not paying attention. So working together is where we can get the benefits and hopefully avoid some of the burdens that come along with that. So if we're going to talk about social justice, we need to kind of at least talk about it in terms of some of the questions that are going to be raised by it. Now, I'm not going to talk about a lot of these questions, but these are some of the basic questions that are going to come up anytime you're dealing with new science, new technology, right? Pretty much any sort of policy decision even that doesn't have to do with science. So who reaps the benefits and who shoulders the burdens of the changes that are going to go on with policy, with technology? How do we make decisions about what technologies to pursue, what types of scientific projects to pursue, how these get implemented in terms of policy? Then when you're dealing with social justice, one of the problems we're going to have to deal with is inequality. There are issues of extreme inequality and how can science either help alleviate or exacerbate those problems. And then, of course, how do we restore a sense of justice in community? As I said, these are questions, hopefully different parts throughout the series, not tonight per se, but different parts of the series will address some of these questions. But I want to address three slightly different questions that are, in some sense, more foundational, in the sense that they come before these questions here. And that is, when you're talking about social justice, who counts? Why do they count? And how much do they count? If we're going to talk about social justice, the first thing we have to figure out is who's going to reap benefits and who's going to experience the burdens. We have to figure out who's even in the conversation and why they're there. And that's kind of what I want to talk about today. And I'm going to do it in part by looking at some science fiction. Before we get there, right, let's kind of look at, very briefly, a list of scientific developments in the 20th century, which have possibly can be seen as having ethical errors associated with them. So there's some things like the internal combustion engine. This has clearly been a benefit to humanity in the sense of transportation. I mean, I can now buy sushi here and not get sick, which if you think about it, we're about as far away from an ocean as you can get on the planet, and yet we can still get fresh enough fish because transportation makes that possible. The internal combustion engine does that. And of course, the internal combustion engine kicks out CO2 at such a rate that it is causing issues of global climate change. Now, it's not the lone actor in that, right? But it's one of them, right? Atomic and nuclear weapons, nuclear waste storage, right? And here's where you can start seeing some differences. To some extent, the internal combustion engine we are almost all benefiting from, and we're almost all experiencing the burdens because it's atmospheric. But when you get to nuclear waste storage, you've got a different issue. Where you store the nuclear waste is going to have a major impact on who lives near those places. And it's going to have extreme negative impacts, if there's any form of leakage, on the health and well-being of those individuals. And we have lots of experience of that, right? Where I grew up in Northwest Ohio, we have a nuclear power plant, right? But we don't store the waste anywhere near there. They store it in other places. They send it down, some of it to Kentucky. They put it in a place that they said would never, even if everything would leak, it would take tens of thousands of years before that radiation and that leakage would have any sort of problem. It only took them about 20 before they started finding the radiation signatures from that leakage downstream about 100 miles away into communities that were poor and rural and were suffering health effects from them. Right? So you start having that. Asbestos, you've got the same problem. I remember as a kid, they removed asbestos from my high school. We had to close it down for a month. Right? We had to go somewhere else. But there are a lot of high schools that still have asbestos in them, and their ceilings don't look like this. The kids are exposed directly to the asbestos, so they're breathing it in still because they're too poor to remove it. They're too poor to keep it secure. And so you start seeing that there's these differential impacts from these scientific advances. Well, I'm sure we'll get an opportunity, perhaps even later today, to talk about this stuff on the your right-hand side, where these were medical and social science experiments that were done, usually on populations that lacked autonomy, lacked the ability to say no. They were done on children, they were done on homeless people, they were done on people who were US soldiers or prisoners, and therefore had very limited ability to say no to experiments that they didn't understand and what was going to happen. So those are the past mistakes. The current ethical problems, here's just 4 of them, right? Stem cell research. We've been going on and on and on about this for quite some time. We're still not really settled on what we're going to do with that, even though we can produce stem cell lines that don't require that we basically take unborn zygotes and start playing around with them from after they've been frozen. More recently, there's this development of CRISPR-Cas9, which is a technique for editing genes that we could be there's a lot of research being done now on the social impacts of using CRISPR-Cas9. But what I want to talk about is the SETI program, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. And I want to talk about artificial intelligence, because I think these come together into those questions of, well, who's going to count and why? And of course, these are questions that are brought about through science fiction a lot, right? Whether it's in novels or movies, right? So we have an alien from the Alien series, right? There's extraterrestrial life. Not exactly the image of something that's warm and cuddly, right? The Alien series is not a very pleasant series. And then we have, from the original Blade Runner movie, right, a replicant, who basically throughout the movie, until pretty much the scene where this picture is taken from, is on a murderous rampage in order to try to extend his own life. And it says right at the very beginning about how this group of replicants, this artificial intelligence, was enslaved. And they picked this back up in the most recent movie, in Blade Runner 2049, as well. So I want to talk a little bit about this problem, right? What would it be like with artificial intelligence? What would it be like for us to interact with actual aliens, right? So here's the core question, right? And there's a lot of overlap with research into ethics in animals in this, right? How will we view or value or integrate non-humans into our communities, right? We have 2 very, very different pictures here, right? There we have children and parents and animals in a petting zoo, right? We have someone lovingly holding an animal. And then we have a picture of experiments being done in the eyes of rabbits. These experiments will possibly blind some of them. And of course, we do these experiments because the eyes of rabbits are the most closely related to human eyes. So we can get an idea of what chemicals, what will actually do to the human eye by seeing what they do there. I mean, these are 2 very different pictures of our relationship with non-humans. And science fiction explores that as well. And so what I want to look at, some of you might be familiar with the very first novel at the top, Ender's Game. It was made into a movie a few years ago. Orson Scott Card wrote that novel because he wanted to write a second novel, Speaker for the Dead. And that's the novel I want to talk about. Because Speaker for the Dead involves both artificial intelligence and extraterrestrial life. And both of those things, the key idea behind all of this is that human beings are afraid of the non-humans they're interacting with. Now, because I'm going to talk about the second novel, I need to fill in some details here. For those of you who haven't seen Ender's Game, there's a character, Andrew Wiggin, nicknamed Ender. He's 11 years old. He is taken in by Earth Defense Forces, and the Earth Defense Forces use him, unbeknownst to him, to wipe out an alien species. And once that's happened, at the end, he finds one of the eggs of the queens of this and takes that egg with him, with the idea that he's going to undo his xenocide that he was involved in. The second novel involves him as well, Speaker for the Dead. It's set 3,000 years later. Basically, he goes at a near light-speed ship that results in all sorts of time distortions, which allows him to travel way in the past. And nobody knows that Andrew Wiggin is still alive, except for his brother and sister. The setup of the story is that he's now 25. I'm sorry, he's now 36, 25 years later. And he wrote a book called 3,000 years later, humanity has finally come across another intelligent species on a planet called the Lusitania, where humans are studying these creatures called pequeninos, which is a Portuguese term. And what it means is piggies, because they look like pigs here on Earth. It's a group of people there, one of which is a woman named Novena, and she discovers that there is a virus on the planet, and it is killing off all of the human beings, and that it's basically infested every living thing on the planet, which has put it under quarantine. Her basic father, a man named Pipo, raised her to be a xenobiologist just like he was. And then one day he goes off to visit the piggies, where he is killed, cut open, and a tree is planted inside of it. This seems to have been unprovoked, and this is what causes Novena to call Ender Wiggin to the planet in order to basically give his eulogy. She changes her mind, though, in a few days. The problem is once you enter into light speed like that, it basically takes him, Ender, about 2 or 3 days to get there. And 22 years passes on the planet. So he gets there much later. Novena is in love with Pipo's son, Lebo. And Lebo dies in a similar fashion, basically figuring out what had happened to his father, and he then dies. And on top of all of this, Novena is married to a woman named Marco, or Marcau. My Portuguese is pretty non-existent. And this is important because Marcau is not a very good person. He's not well liked. And this is going to come into play, we see later on in the novel. So that's kind of the background, right? But when we get to the very opening page of the story, this is the very beginning of it. It's not even part of the story. Demosthenes is actually Andrew Wiggins' sister riding under a pen name. And this sets up the problem of the entire novel, and arguably the entire series. And she says, since we are not yet fully comfortable with the idea that people from the next village are as human as ourselves, it is presumptuous in the extreme to suppose we could ever look at sociable, tool-making creatures who arose from other evolutionary paths and not see beasts but brothers, not rivals but fellow pilgrims journeying to the shrine of intelligence. Yet that is what I see, or yearn to see. The difference between Raman and Var-Else, I'll explain what those mean in a moment, is not in the creature judged, but in the creature judging. When we declare an alien species to be Raman, it does not mean that they have passed the threshold of moral maturity. It means that we have. This is interesting to me because this flips on its head a lot of moral philosophy, right? Because as I said, there was this event, and Demosthenes continued, or this is actually Andrew Wiggin, speaking in a classroom like this on another planet. He says, suppose that we had learned that the piggies, because all these college students know who they are, had suddenly, without provocation, tortured to death a xenologist or sent to slay them. Doesn't the very fact of this incomprehensible murder make the piggies Var-Else instead of Raman? So what do those two terms mean? Well, the novel tells us of this thing called the Nordic Order of Foreignness. So these are somewhat made up Nordic terms, but their definitions definitely are for the purpose of the novel. So an Udvaning is an otherlander, a stranger that we recognize as being human of our world, but of another place, another city or country. The Framling is the stranger that we recognize as human, but of another world. Right? Very different from us. Raman is the stranger that we again recognize as human, but of another species. Then you get to Var-Else. It's the true alien where no conversation is possible. They might be intelligent, but we can't know it. And then there's the Jur, which is the dire beast, right? This is the creature who is not human and whose sole purpose is going to be our destruction. And he says, so this is what they're getting at. Where are these aliens going to fall, right? And this is a big major cutoff point. Everything above here seems to be, in some sense, in our community, and this down here is outside. Well, what I think is going on here is that Orson Scott Card is developing this idea of moral status. He's doing it in an interesting way. He's doing it in a novel, and he's using it to explore how it is we let people into our community. Australian philosopher Rosalind Hursthouse defines moral status this way. It's a concept supposed to divide everything into two classes. Things that have moral status are within the circle of moral concern, and things that do not, which are outside the circle. In short, the way here's this nice rock. You take a chisel, you pick up this rock, you take the chisel, you take a hammer, you hit it, you break it open. Right? You see this beautiful geode. We didn't do anything wrong to the rock morally. Right? The rock's not in the world of moral concern. But that's my daughter at the other end. If you did something like that to her, if you took a chisel and you cracked open her head in the same way, everybody would recognize that we have done something morally wrong to her. That she has been harmed morally, because she's inside the realm of moral concern. But the problem is that there's all this other stuff. And are those things in, or are they out? Are they part of the moral community or not? Right? Can we treat this item just like this one? Or is this item something that for a variety of reasons should be more treated like this one? Right? So that's the question. That's the problem. And of course, we start talking about animals and other things, and it gets very confusing. And of course, this is where supposedly philosophers are going to help us out. And we're going to conceptually discuss some distinctions. So here are some. Moral considerability. Are you morally considerable? Do I have to take into account your interests? We have to take into account my daughter's interests. We don't have to take into account the interests of the rock, in large part because rocks don't have some. Flowers might have interests, but they're going to be different and have to be conceptualized different than us if they have them at all. So that's a toggle concept. Either you're in or you're out. Moral relevance, on the other hand, tells us why you're in or out. So there's that second of those questions from a while ago. Why are you in? And philosophers have come up with a lot of different answers. Some of them focus on physical characteristics. Right? In other words, your genes, or are you alive? Other ones have focused on psychological characteristics. Peter Singer famously focuses on some of those, where he looks at, well, can you experience pain and pleasure? There's all sorts of other views. Immanuel Kant and some of his followers, interestingly, say that you're only in if you're a moral agent, which turns out to be far fewer individuals than I think Kant and a lot of his people realize. And then there are relational notions, right? Do you play a role in an ecosystem, for example? Because that might get you moral status or moral considerability, right? Have you formed a relationship with something else, right? You might have formed a relationship with your own pet dog that means it's got moral status and you have to take its interest into account. But what about the stray? I have no relationship with the stray. So that might be different. So those are the different reasons why someone might be morally considerable. And then we get into the problem of moral importance. And here's where social justice comes back. Because now once we know that you're in, and now that we know why you're in, we don't live in paradise. What we do live in is a world of limited resources. And sometimes we have to make hard choices. And even though someone might be morally considerable, they might be left on the outside. And, as Russ and I were talking, in the 1960s, Garrett Hardin was suggesting that we were going to be in a big problem with this on the planet as overall, right? There's only enough room in the boat for 3 of us, and there's 5 of us. Who has to go? The brand new child, the old lady, you, the person who has medical conditions, right? Who's going to get thrown overboard, right? Because if you don't throw 2 of us overboard, all 5 of us are going to die. basing some of this off of some ideas from Malthus in the 19th century, there was this idea that we could make new resources to feed the planet along basically an algebraic kind, or not algebraic, but a direct linear way. But population growth, he thought, was going to be like this. And then once you crossed this point, you were in a crisis. You were in a lifeboat situation, as Highland would put it. So if we were to get to that point, who of the morally considerable beings are we going to consider more or less significant to make the hard choices? Now, hopefully, we don't ever find ourselves in that. In fact, I think Highland and Malthus got it radically wrong, and there's a lot of empirical evidence to suggest that. So if we take that, what we end up with then is this interpretation of what's going on in the novel. To be an Utlani is to be recognized as morally considerable and to speak the same language, right? They're from the same city. We recognize the Freilings as morally considerable, but they don't talk the same language, both literally and figuratively. The Ramen are people who are morally considerable, but of another species, and yet we can communicate with them, like we can communicate with all sorts of animals in our world. But then the Varels are those who are not morally considerable, specifically because we cannot enter into conversation. And the Juror are not morally considerable because not only can we not talk to them, but they are a threat to our existence. So here we have a relational theory of moral relevance about who gets in and who is left out, based on communication and understanding. So, in the novels, what seem to be the two options for responding to the aliens? The ones that we're not sure where they fall. Are they Ramen or Varels? In Ender's Game, the Formics, known as the Buggers, because they look basically like the creatures from Alien in a lot of ways, the response was xenocide. Wipe out an entire alien species. But in Speaker for the Dead, and the following two novels, it suggests that there's another option. That yes, the piggies may have murdered someone, although that's up for debate. But maybe with patience and empathy and understanding of the aliens, working toward it, maybe we can bring them into the community. And xenocide is not the option. Now, this is just part of a rather large amount of literature that deals with the same thing, and that's kind of my suggestion. If we continue to look for intelligent life, we don't know what we're going to get. And we need to figure out how we're going to treat this life. And literature has had lots of different answers. Science fiction literature has often depicted alien life as a threat. Something that xenocide would be the proper answer. But then there's the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still. It gives a radically different answer. The alien comes here. The alien looks like us. The alien just wants to basically give us a warning. The universe is the type of place where if you continue to behave like you're behaving here on planet Earth in the 1950s and 60s, we're going to take you out. Shape up and enter the community, or risk that we will destroy you. 1980s, we get a movie based off of a Nebula Award-winning novella, Enemy Mine, where two humans and non-humans are at war. And one of each side of that war gets stuck on a planet after a battle. And it begins after a very long period of trying to understand each other to survive. The opportunity for these two alien races to live together. And in a much underappreciated story, The Keys to December by a science fiction author named Roger Zelazny, we get almost all of this in one of those rare science fiction stories where humans don't even appear. So literature is giving us different answers. Xenocide might be it, but maybe patience and understanding is the way to go as well. And then finally, much more recently, recently translated from the Chinese, is something called the Three Body Problem Trilogy. This is a very interesting and intense set of novels that also basically raises the same kinds of second technology problem and science problem has to do with artificial intelligence. Jane is the artificial intelligence in these novels. And in a quote that I believe is from Andrew Wiggin, talking about Jane, who is befriended, and the only person who knows that Jane even exists. And the reason is that as Jane had learned, human beings had long been afraid that someone like her would come to exist. And in all the stories, she was hated. And her coming meant either her certain murder or the destruction of mankind. Even before she was born, human beings had imagined her, and in imagining her, had slain her 1,000 times. Because there's all sorts of literature about artificial life and artificial intelligence. These are two of the worst. Right? HAL 9000 from 2001. A computer that goes insane because it's got contradictory directives and doesn't know how to make them work and starts murdering human beings. If you have never read the story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, read it exactly once in your life. It's worth it, but you will not sleep for days. Because this is about the most horrific version of artificial intelligence and human interaction I've ever come across. And of course, there are the classics, Frankenstein and the Golem. These ideas that science can produce life in a way, but we are not going to be able to control it, and it's going to damage us. And then much more recently, of course, we get more benign versions of artificial intelligence with Data in Star Trek. And it's not quite sure what's going on with Westworld. But in both cases, one of the things that's always kind of at issue is Maeve morally considerable, and so we should have problems with the hundreds of thousands of times she has been murdered and raped and used and seen as just a thing? Or is she more than that? Is she something that should be seen as part of the moral community, and we should have a great deal of concern about the way that we behave? In a very famous episode having to do with Data, that was the key question. Is Data a person, or is Data a thing? Which is another way in which this notion of moral considerability gets worked out. Again, two different options, two different possibilities, most of which are pretty bad. But of course, this really reflects back to right now and questions of social justice. In the novel, I've mentioned Pipo, who was the one killed, his stepdaughter, Novina, and her husband, Marcos, or Marco. Right? Pipo said to Novina, who had already been on the outside, he said, "You're a great-hearted one. You're in this small community. You chose not to be part of the bands of children who grouped together for their sole purpose of excluding others. And that isolated you. You, in a sense, to humanity, are the alien mind, because you wouldn't do that. You know what it is to be unhuman because there's never been any human group that gave you the credentials as an actual Homo sapien. You might be human genetically, but you've been excluded, and you didn't want to play in those exclusion games." But of course, we do this in other ways, in ways that touch really close to a lot of our politics right now. On her husband, because he dies in the novel as well, Ender gives his eulogy of her husband, Marco. His third name was Cow, or dog. You never heard of him having a friend, and none of you was ever glad to see him come into a room. That's what the man you knew, Cow. Hardly a man at all. You called him a dog, and so he became one. He became another species. He became a thing. He became something outside of the community. We've got a long way to go. And science and technology and the products of those in terms of meeting artificial intelligence, or creating artificial intelligence, or meeting alien life forms, is going to be a problem. Because this is the hope, and this is the goal of the novel, that we can change that, right? That what we want to see is that the difference between the Raman and Bar-Else is not in the creature itself. It's not some property that you have that you are able to feel pain that makes you win, right? It's whether or not we, as a matter of our character, are willing to grant moral considerability to something else. And when we do that, that means we have passed a moral maturity threshold. So are we going to be able to extend that and see other people as those who are considerable, who have a great deal of significance, even when they're different from us? And how are we going to work then for greater experiences and greater situations of social justice? Thank you. So what's next?
Do you guys have any questions for him before we move on to the panel? Questions? Mike, you want to start the panel?
Okay.
Oh, do you have a question?
Yeah, kind of. Are you factoring in Lil Nick Bostrom's work and Great Filter of Rollins and all that to reach this threshold of super intelligence? You have to go through some of these simulations, etc.
Right. So here's the interesting thing, right, about Bostrom's work. And there's a lot of interesting things here in terms of this post-humanism and how that's going to work. But what I'm talking about in terms of the threshold is not something that really requires intelligence, right? It doesn't mean anybody has to be anything more intelligent than ourselves. In fact, there's really good evidence from experiments that have been done in observations that animals with much less intelligence than us are able to actually demonstrate the ability to take in other species. Right? You see this not often. They're usually in more forced environments, right, where animals of different species come to care for each other. And so it's not a matter of getting into a new level of intelligence, right? But of course, if Bostrom's ideas become reality, right, and we actually end up with a speciesism kind of a species break, right, where we've got what we now think of as Homo sapiens, and now we end up with post-humans. How are those two groups going to interact with each other? And I worry about that, right? Especially with social justice issues, because ideally, or the way that a lot of this stuff is described, post-humans are going to be a lot like, right, the replicants, right? They're going to be more human than human. And you're going to be at a major disadvantage intellectually and perhaps in some other ways, depending on how much in the way of body modifications you're getting, genetic manipulation you're getting. And so you could run into some pretty serious rebuilding of this without ever getting off the planet. But
I'm wondering if you could factor in there's a lot of this stuff's going on right now. And near as I can tell, in the last 50 years, human beings have been moving a little slow for this moral consideration we talk about. Is there a way for you to, so to speak, dumb it down and make these presentations for grade school kids? Because
it's called Harry Potter.
Not prepared for.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it's called Harry Potter and children's literature. There is an unbelievable amount of great children's literature, and if you think about the Harry Potter series specifically, what's the point of that? Well, you've got the Death Eaters who are like, if you're not a wizard, if you're a muggle, right, or you're a wizard born but you can't use it, then you are not worthy. But on the other side of that is a group of heroes, some of which come from wizards' families, one of which happens to be female, so has another whole layer of issues there about being on the outside and less significant. And you see, and there's been some empirical work, although I haven't looked at it directly, to show that the kids who grew up reading Harry Potter and loving that are much more willing to sit there and go, I don't see the difference between people from the United States and Mexico. I don't see the difference between men and women. I don't see the moral difference between Caucasians and people who are descended from Africa or India. I mean, if you want to know how it gets worked out and how it gets dumbed down in children's literature in ways that, of course, scare a lot of adults, right? Because, I've read, stuff to my kids Harry Potter, but only so far because they're 7 and 9. They're not quite ready to get on to, I think, dealing with death in book 4. They're not quite ready for deeper discussions of the significance in C.S. Lewis of some of these things. So, I mean, I think that's where it happens. And part of my research program is to convince people in literature that here's, along with a whole bunch of other moral concepts from analytic philosophy, are new sets of interpretive lenses that you can use in interpreting that, and then also bringing that more to the fore when you're talking to children about that. So that's how do you dumb down philosophy? You write really good literature, which means you haven't dumbed it down at all. Other questions before we move on? Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. So, for our panel discussion, we have all these nice chairs up here. So, if you're on the panel, let's see, we can introduce you as you come up. We got Dr. Bruce Gleamore, the philosophy department head and professor who specializes in the philosophy of biology, specializing in ethics over at Kansas State University.
Hey, everybody.
Next up is Dr. Evan E. Hart. She is assistant professor of history at Missouri Western State University. She has a background in the history of medicine with a special interest in the activism of women of color during the women's health movement. And hopefully nobody's forgotten Dr. Paul, who was just over here, but now he's moved over here. It's a trick of the light. Dr. Deanne Droyne, Native American physician, recently retired from clinical practice, but she still does community health with 4 Kansas reservation tribes. And last but not least is Sarah Wilson, anthropologist and executive director of the Galore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri. Thank you all for coming out. And
Mike Kelly gets the last seat.
yeah, the one. I hope everybody's comfortable here. I tried to make this extra classy. We've got a nice centerpiece there, and in fall colors. So I'd like to. We're trying to work on our feng shui. So hopefully you're feeling the positive mojo. All right. So first question to our panel is: oftentimes scientists and doctors engage in questionable practices by citing the greater good. So if these practices do further the greater good, why are they generally viewed negatively? Do sort of like Tuskegee syphilis experiment and that kind of thing. That's what I do at department meetings.
So I have something to say about this, but I'll defer.
No, go ahead.
I got to talk for half an hour. I don't want to say anything.
So sometimes, because the practices are really awful, and the Tuskegee experiments are like that. Does everybody know about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment? Anybody not know about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment? Okay, so beginning in 1932, I think, and ending in 1972, there was a study done, centered at Tuskegee University, where African American men who had syphilis were recruited, studied, the purpose nominally being to develop treatments. In 1932 there were no good treatments, but pretty quickly that nominal aim disappeared. So these men were told they were being provided care, but in fact were not treated for syphilis. By 1946, penicillin is not only known to be an effective treatment, it's widely available. It's expensive then, but it's still available. 600 subjects were enrolled. Of them, 339 had actually diagnosed with syphilis, had syphilis. They weren't told of their diagnosis. Of those, 128 died from syphilis or related causes. 40 of their wives were infected, and 15 or 20 children were lost, born with syphilis. And the study went on for bloody ever until it was eventually stopped as a result of public outcry. So this was a vile thing, pretty much from the get-go. The similar studies were occurring at the same time. There was a less famous study in Guatemala. So sometimes it's really awful stuff. Sometimes it's a mistake. So there's a chemical engineer who destroyed the world twice over. He's the only guy that ever destroyed the world twice over. Thomas Midgley Jr. He's the greatest chemical engineer ever. The first thing he did was invent leaded gasoline. If you don't know about the effects of lead on human health, human IQ, human behavior, it's nasty stuff, and it's nasty stuff at even low doses. So the kind you get from depositions from exhaust from leaded gasoline. So he invented this stuff, and he knew it was pretty nasty. He invented it to eliminate engine knock, and defended it until his death. He never gave up on it. The second thing he invented, destroyed the world the second time over, was chlorofluorocarbons, which were invented as a coolant, but then destroyed the greenhouse gas layer. He didn't know any better, right? So that second invention saved lives, right? It was actually a big deal, and if for a little bit it was a very good big deal, right? Long run, it's trouble. So maybe this is internal combustion engines are like this, right? They have an immediate positive effect on well-being, in the long run they're bad. And two other things that happen though. Sometimes the scientists got it right. It's actually what they're doing is a good thing. But you don't see the good benefits, right? They're concealed. And sometimes it works the other way around. You see the benefits, but not the costs. So neonatal care is really, really good. But we got there at the price of prenatal care, which in this country sucks, right? So we developed this great neonatal stuff that saves literally 25,000 lives a year, but at the price of a whole bunch of infants that never get born or get born and die because we don't actually provide good prenatal care. So now I'll shut up.
No.
Or who live with various disabilities as a result of the
Absolutely. So, following up on this, one of the things that I'm talking about in terms of this moral considerability and stuff is there's this distinction between having value in and of yourself, having moral value, having intrinsic value. Lots of different terms, not identical, but they're closely related. And then having merely instrumental value. And part of the problem that we see sometimes with science is that when you start talking about the greater good, you end up instrumentalizing large groups of living things. Their value is in their use and in their use only. And other things are valued, not instrumentally, but morally, right? So you start talking about abortion, and all of a sudden there's this argument that there are people who are deeply, deeply, deeply worried about the moral value of zygotes and embryos and fetuses, but seem to have almost no value for recently born children. Now, that's probably not a fair characterization, right? But you can kind of see that, and in fact, you might even see that part of the political and policy argument is using children and unborn children for political gains. Well, you're not valuing them morally anymore, even though on the surface that's what you're saying. And so part of that problem with the greater good is that distinction. Well, in order to do that, maybe we've left something out that we're supposed to be doing. And if I can plug another science fiction story, one I know that Mike knows, right? The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. It's a very, very short little story. It's not much of a narrative, but it's a really, really powerful story. And at some point, you realize that one of the characters is in a broom closet, because that's the character that's been treated as nothing but an instrument, and only instrumentally valuable as a tool.
Okay, so kind of taking off on this, the idea of greater good and sort of instrumental value. So
But some people would be much wealthier.
How would we be worse?
Well, so I mean, I'm speaking from the perspective of the director of the Gore Psychiatric Museum, and I'm an anthropologist, so I study human beings, right? And so how would we be worse? Well, you know, oftentimes when you're looking at the field of psychiatry, you know, throughout history, we have dehumanized people in order to use that as an argument to slaughter them, do experiments on them, lobotomies. And so if we were to say, let's take humanity out of the picture, let's not have ethical or moral considerations, I think we would sacrifice a lot of people in the process. And I think that we would lose science fiction and writing and art and human relations that are valuable and significant. So yeah, I think we would definitely be worse if we removed our humanness out of the equation.
We'd be amoral dudes, and that's not a happy thing to be.
If you're amoral, though, you probably wouldn't really care.
Well, yeah, I would if everybody else was amoral.
Have you known amoral people? Because I don't like them.
No, I mean, I know of them.
Well, even in a lot of those studies, though, we actually don't get that much out of them. So I mean, if you look at the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, for example, we didn't actually learn all that much. So it has a huge human cost without us actually learning much of anything significant.
Penicillin was known about by 1946. These studies went on into the 1970s. They had the cure. They knew how to cure syphilis. They knew exactly what syphilis did to people. And we had tons of patients at our hospital, 30s and 40s. Overnight with penicillin, you can cure this. They let it go on 30 years. And particularly alarming with the Tuskegee study is just, and with a lot of psychiatry, is that idea of informed consent. That you're consenting to let something be done to you. And what the patients were told was happening to them was not what they were getting. And that's the same case with lobotomies. And you know, I mean, right now, particularly in the United States, we have a huge opioid epidemic, and that's of concern to me because doctors were told that OxyContin, you know, your Percocets, your Vicodins weren't addictive, and then they were passing them on to patients, telling them that you can take as much as this as you like. And we have a huge crisis in our community because people were lied to for profit by amoral, inhuman people who were selling this to make a profit, and it's made our whole society worse.
So can I ask a question of the anthropologist? I don't know if the panel's allowed to ask. So the cause and effect relationship between dehumanization and immoral behavior.
Sure.
So as you put it, and I think this is true in the literature that Jim cited, the dehumanization causes the aberrant behavior. But you could think about it the other way around, right? That aberrant behavior is going to happen anyway, and the way we tell ourselves a story, so that we can live with ourselves when we do that, is to dehumanize those who suffer under the policies.
Sure.
So, do you have a view about how often that works one way or the other?
Every time we go to war, right? I mean, in order for us to kill other human beings in war, we have to say, this is other, right? This is not me, and so it's okay for me to kill them, even though we know that's not right.
Or want their land.
Right.
Or want to bring them as slaves.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sort of thinking that there must have been some sort of moral compass shift in the 70s. Because around the same time that the Tuskegee experiment was ended was a time when we became aware that sterilization without consent of Native women had been going on. And in fact, I can remember sort of, I mean, this may sound very bizarre, but it's like
we have plenty of practice with
know you know. I know you know about that. So.
No, I'm used to the one-on-one myself. So, where would you like me to start with what I was saying? I don't know.
I didn't hear any of the last that you said.
Oh, okay. So what I said was that in 1976, the United States Government Accounting Office released a report documenting that at least 3,400 Native women had been sterilized without their consent in the Indian Health Service in different regions, of which there are 12.
Well, that went on, I mean, not just with Native women or indigenous women, but, you know, in Atlanta, the Grady Hospital was injecting African-American women with Depo-Provera, telling them that they were giving them B12 shots. And if you don't know what Depo is, that's basically an injectable contraceptive. So it'll last for about 3 to 4 months, telling them that they were injecting them with you know, various kinds of vitamins, or telling them that, you know, this is a shot that will help you not have children, without explaining that it has pretty horrific side effects and that there's nothing to counter those side effects. If you're on, for example, the pill, you just stop taking the pill, and, you know, within 24 hours it'll be out of your system. But with Depo, it'll be in your system until it is metabolized out, which is going to be months. And there are states that are sterilizing, especially women with a variety of what we might now call developmental disabilities, well into the 90s or the early 2000s, where there are finally state laws saying that you can't, you know, sterilize. So it's, you know, kind of coming out more in the 70s that these things are happening, but they continue on well past, you know, into the 90s and even the early 2000s.
And one of the things you have to look at there too is look at the populations that we're talking about, right? We're talking about poor urban populations, we're talking about Native American and Native peoples populations, and was this view that what they were doing was for the greater good, that we were going to help these people have fewer children and therefore have fewer people on welfare, and making a whole bunch of assumptions about what the life would be like of these individuals. And
I think you're giving them too much.
Am I giving them too much credit?
So you can sort of date the rise of this kind of policy to the eugenics movement, which in some sense begins in the late 1800s, but really takes over in the beginning of the 1900s, when Darwin is social. It's not Darwin; it's social Darwinism is melded with genetics and then population genetics, and the view is exactly the view Michael was talking about. We are going to be better as a race, as a people, as a species, by changing the genetic biological composition of us. So it's not for the greater good, and it's certainly not for the good of the people who suffer these events.
Yeah, I didn't want to tamp down on the complete racism that was underlying.
But no, these guys are by our lights vile, and they're not amoral, but what they value is markedly different than what we would recognize as.
I'm not sure everybody knows what eugenics is.
So raise your hand if you don't know what eugenics is. All right, so let me tell you something about eugenics. So the idea is Darwin. So this is a total misrepresentation of Darwin, but it's not a total misrepresentation of a set of people reading Darwin. So Darwin says survival of the species depends on the fitter individual. So what we really want to do is make our country, our race, our species fitter. And the way we make folks fitter is we eliminate the less fit. And now you can guess who gets called the less fit. It's exactly the least privileged in society, right? The poor, whatever races are regarded as lowest on the totem pole. So African American really got it hard, but in the turn of the century, Southern Europeans, so Italian immigrants suffer this sort of victimization. So if you're socially on the bottom, you're gonna get it, right? And so this movement persisted up through World War II. And then when we went and looked at the Nazis, the set of adherents decreased. It's still out there, but no respectable scientist now endorses anything like that view.
So this coming out of a thinking in the late 1800s that's trying to classify the world. And so Darwin's going out and he's finding all of these different species and he's seeing how they're interconnected and they're related, and some species survive and some species don't, and there's a whole bunch of different kinds of elk, and they're similar but different than horses and giraffes. And so they're taxonomically going out and trying to study and classify the natural world, plants, animals, birds, fish, and they do the same thing with human beings. And so anthropologists and museums also try to go out and classify different cultures and races. And so just like you have a taxonomical chart for species, you have a taxonomical chart for races at the time, and the races that probably had less privilege would have been placed at the bottom, and then it would grow. And so, like you say, it culminates with the Nazis trying to say, we're going to get rid of everyone who's not like us. And it's perfectly okay to do experiments and all kinds of nasty things to other people, or even mass genocide, because what we're looking for is this pure race that we classify as a pure race. And it's
so on this classification issue, so with the connection with science fiction, have you ever done anything on the Planet of the Apes? So I can remember going to
I watched the old stuff. I haven't watched the new ones yet.
Well, I meant the old stuff.
Okay.
So I can remember as a kid going to the American Museum of Natural History.
Yeah. And
there would be these exhibits of the evolution of man, and they would include some racist bullshit. Sorry for the friends that there.
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that stuff too.
Yeah. So there'd be these dioramas with here are the dinosaurs, and here's the African savanna, and here is pick your favorite Amazonian tribe, right? As exhibits, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So there's this scene, and if I remember right, in the old Planet of the Apes, where they're walking through an exhibit where humans, right, are, and that was a really shocking thing back in the day. And that marks that turn of the enlivening of the ethical horizon.
Right. And of course, in the original ones, it turns out that there aren't just gorillas, right? There's all the other species of apes, and it turns out that some species of apes are more significant than other ones, and human beings are at the bottom. Human beings can't even talk, and that, of course, this notion of being able to talk and to be able to communicate has historically been a sign of intelligence. And whether or not something could or could not talk, could or could not learn to talk, could learn or learn to talk the proper European languages, was a mark of whether you were significant. If you dial your significance down to 0, you were no longer, we can do anything we want to.
And that's what happens when European settlers encounter the New World and they see Native Americans living here and they claim this land for Spain. They discover this land and now it is theirs. And they don't take into account that all of these people who are already living here have had this land. Like this was theirs, but because they can't speak the same language, or maybe they don't have the same technology with guns or these sorts of things, it makes it okay.
Or the same idea of how property works.
Absolutely.
Or even ideas of pain. Because I know, when you study a lot of American scientists and American physicians looking at indigenous peoples, looking at especially African Americans, the argument being that that they don't feel pain at the same level, and that they are subhuman, right? And actually there's a debate happening amongst a lot of American scientists over whether all of man is descended from the same Adam and Eve, whether we're monogenists, like everyone is descended from the same human ancestor, or whether the world is actually polygynous, meaning we're actually descended from different sort of Adams and Eves, if you will. And because the argument goes, especially for Southern slaveholders, that African Americans are not descended from the same Adam and Eve. Thus, women, African American women, do not suffer the curse of Eve, which is to have pain during childbirth. And thus, if they don't experience pain during childbirth, then the forced, I don't say forced breeding, because it's horrifically sounding, but
proper.
The forced breeding of African American women is wholly just. And then, no, I don't know how many of us know about J. Marion Sims, physician Sims. So he's kind of considered the father of gynecology, who practiced a surgery for basically fixing what's called a vesicovaginal fistula, which is when there is a tear in the vagina, which is very, very common during childbirth. And he practices on enslaved women without anesthetic, arguing that they feel no pain. Right? So that also justifies this idea that you can treat people a certain way, that you can disregard evidence of their pain, and thus they're not the same moral beings. They're not the same level because they don't feel pain, which obviously we know is wholly false. But there are ideas that are still really prevalent, because there was a recent study where they interviewed med students from when they entered into med school to when they were physicians, that found they consistently underrate the pain of people of color, that they believe in myths, for example, that African Americans have thicker skin, thus you should use larger needles, which are more painful. So there are ideas that are still really prevalent, sort of shockingly prevalent, I would think.
On the other hand, we can get really bad behavior without that. So there's Semmelweis, yes, and puerperal fever. So Semmelweis is a physician working in Vienna, a maternity hospital. It's a general hospital, but includes a maternity ward where every woman who goes in dies from puerperal or childbed fever. It turns out this is because physicians are attending the women after having done dissections. And Semmelweis discovers this and ends up saving a lot of lives. But to do it, he forms a hypothesis, he's pretty confident it's right, and then he does some non-consensual experiments where he infects the women and kills them. Yeah, as a result. But there's no racism involved in that. It's just amoral.
So if we look back on the dark ages here,
I was going to say, it's not that long ago.
Like yesterday.
2004.
So I guess, yes, how much progress would you say that we've made in regards to the science and ethics today?
I have a lot of questions. my burning question that I read yesterday, 2 days ago, the Golden State Killer. Did you guys read about this? So they just solved the mystery of the Golden State Killer, and the FBI and the DEA or whatever, they combined their resources, and they had a DNA sample from 30, 40 years ago, and they tracked down via ancestry that he was the killer. So I'm assuming, I think in the story too, it wasn't his profile, it was maybe his brothers or his sisters. Like, is that okay? I mean,
they got it wrong first time.
Did they?
Yeah, they got it wrong. They interviewed a guy because the profile matched enough that they thought it could be him, so they actually interviewed the wrong guy.
Is this the one that turned out to be the police officer?
Yeah, for a while. Yeah.
All right, and they also were able to figure out that he was investigating some of his own cases or something like that?
I don't remember that. But no, but so they actually got it wrong because, you're sort of going backwards with the DNA. So they actually got it wrong the first time around.
So, I mean, imagine if that's your son or something and you put your DNA on Ancestry to track down your long-lost descendants, and all of a sudden your son is now in jail. Now, granted, he shouldn't have been doing what he was doing, but are you giving consent when you give your DNA out there for...
Well, and I'm sure other people can talk about this more, but if you, one of the things you find out when you read the book, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, is that if any of you have ever gone in to have blood drawn or any other biopsy or anything like that, that one of the things that you didn't notice when you were signing off on having that done is that all of that, part of that sample can be used and sent to a lab, and then they could, if it turns out that you've got some sort of interesting, viable problem that they can then exploit for money, you've signed away all your rights to that. It's kind of just an extension of what happened to Henrietta Lacks and her family in some ways. And it's very weird the way property laws work in terms of like bodily fluids and things like that.
Did the students know about her?
Okay, do you guys know about Henrietta Lacks? Anyone? Who doesn't know? See, I know you know more about it than I do.
So Henrietta Lacks was an impoverished African-American woman who was living outside of Baltimore, basically went in and had very advanced cervical cancer. And what they did is they took a sampling of her cells, which is what they would do to diagnose. And what they found is that the cells were...
The cervical is the opening to the uterus.
Yeah. And what they found is that technically it was called an immortal cell line. So essentially her cells would continue to replicate, and they had never had a cell line before that would replicate itself, meaning that it didn't die, because your cells will only split so many times before they die, right? That's just what happens. And hers just kept going and going and going and going. And so they start using it for human research because these cell lines won't die. And then what they find is it's because they're cancer cells. But her family's never compensated. She dies, I think, at age 34 or 35. Quite young. She dies from her cervical cancer. And they basically keep using her cell line.
Still can.
They don't use it as often anymore because there's a whole problem with how it can, I'm using this word as scare quotes, infect other cell lines. And they found that like certain kinds of insect cells are actually better to use and they don't cost as much. But also what they end up doing is they take DNA from her family members as well and don't tell them why to see if they can map part of her genome. And I think it was 2000, I'm going to get the year wrong, like 2008, some scientists put her entire genome up for free online.
Yeah, I remember that.
Just put her genome up for basically any researcher to use it. So her entire genome was up online until basically like her family said, no.
But the cancer genome was, yes.
Yes.
Right.
Correct.
So here's one of the things that I've always struck me as funny about this. Libertarianism is a political view, and it's a political view that talks about small state, that people should be free to make their own choices about their social life. The market should help be the source of how you put goods out there. But one of the core beliefs in libertarianism is that property rights are the foundations of all other rights, including the right to life and everything else. And they also tend to like Locke. And Locke starts off with this idea that the first thing that you have property in is your own body. And yet somehow in American law, that's the one part. It's like, yes, we believe in property rights and everything, but not property rights to your body and the things that come from your body. And then we end up with these situations with like Henrietta Lacks and everybody having their, most of us who if we've had our blood drawn, we're not going to get screwed out of anything because it turns out that we're not interesting enough from a scientific perspective. There's nothing going on there that they can use.
But correct me if I'm wrong, part of that is so that we don't have impoverished people selling kidneys in order to basically, fund their lives, saying that, no, you don't own your kidney that way. You can't sell it.
You can't sell it that way.
Because obviously, right, that it has to be something that's freely given without
coercion. But of course, coercion is one of those, one of the words I say in philosophy are red flagged. Is the moment someone uses the word coercion or freedom or reason or person for that matter, you're probably going to go down some horrible rabbit hole and never get anywhere because these terms, it's not clear what counts.
It is if you just take my definition.
Well, which is what a philosopher would say, right?
It's what everyone says in the end.
Pretty much. Just take my definition, I'll give you all the answers.
Right, can we go back to the last question you asked? So we've been giving medicine a hard time, but maybe it's appropriate to say some of the things it's done well.
Mm-hmm.
So beginning again in 70, I think the Dax case was also 1972.
Yeah, really early.
So 30 years ago, 40 years ago, physicians routinely ignored what patients might wish and didn't take seriously instructions about whether to treat and how to treat. They recommended and then acted on what they judged to be the best treatment. That's changed, and it changed as a result of a series of cases, including a young man known as Dax, who was burned badly in a gas line explosion, and then treated for he was over 60% of his body or something like this, and then treated against his wishes. And burn treatment is excruciatingly painful. For a year and a half, where he was saying, please don't treat, and they went ahead and did it despite his wishes. So he sued, and eventually he won the right to control his own treatment. And as a result, over the next several decades, training began to change in medical schools. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but progress has been made there.
And I'd like to ask Dr. Droy, since you're a practicing physician, could you weigh in on this one?
Oh yeah, and I was sitting here thinking, should I say this or not? Because of course, prior to maybe 1970 or so, that magic decade again, most physicians were men. So these were men making these decisions. Not totally, but mostly. But, you know, I mean, it has to do with, you know, our social status and, you know, equality among genders, etc. You know, a patriarchal system, which fortunately I think we're figuring out how to fix ever so slowly and painfully, as we've recently seen. But what I would actually like to do, if it's okay with you, is I would like to go back to the Native experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And talk about, you know, what you alluded to. I mean, Christopher Columbus or Francis Drake, you know, they land and they say, okay, these people are subhuman. They really aren't like us. And therefore we can do as we wish. And for Native people, there has been, you know, the first era was the era of extermination. And the next era was the era of assimilation, if we're talking about federal policy and people's attitudes. And finally, again in the 70s, we entered the era of self-determination. And as we went through the 19th century, what's really interesting is that I tell people that the people who wanted to put Native children in boarding schools were the good guys, because everybody else wanted to kill the Native people. They were still out there on the prairie shooting them, whether it was, you know, guarding the stagecoach or the cavalry or whatever. And these people said, no, they're human, but they need to be made like us. And so let's cut their hair, make them stop speaking the language. I mean, I think you probably know all about this, but if you haven't, there's a very good book to read called Education for Extinction. And in that case, it's extinguishing the culture, not the individual. And it's written by a couple of Kansans. Adams is the one name I remember, author's name, and it's University of Kansas Press. And it's really easy to read, but it explains, you know, this changing of opinion and the basis that these people, they were humanists, and they felt this was the best thing they could possibly do. Now, unfortunately, it turns out that, you know, they did massive damage in a number of ways by putting children in these schools. And of course, we have we have a couple of examples. There was the Presbyterian mission just a few miles outside of town here, about which I would like to know more history myself. But of course, when I came back to Kansas, I actually was born on the Nebraska side of the line in Maysville. But when I finished residency, I wanted to work for Indian Health, and I was able to come back to Haskell, which was one of the first 3 boarding schools that Congress authorized funding for. And they did that in 1881, so Haskell opened in 1884. And when you read a lot of the literature, they describe how it started with the little children. But in fact, my grandmother entered Haskell at the age of 16 back in something like 1885 or sometime around there. So, but that's sort of our path, you know, federally, but also locally.
You can see that same attempt at cultural extinction in lots of different places. I come from very mixed Eastern European or European background, so Hungarian, Slovak, German, British, and Irish, which 5 entirely different groups of people. But there's a couple of books out on the history of Slovakia, and this is a part of Eastern Europe that is the Austrians, the Germans, the Hungarians, the Russians. Everybody keeps taking over them. And one of the first things that happens every single time is the Germans come in and they make all the state papers have to be done in German, and all the schools now have to be taught in German. So now everybody has to learn German, and if you can't learn German, then you're pushed out. And then, you know, if it's a volatile period, then Hungarians take over. And this completely different language that's not even European is now the state language, and it's all documents are in Hungarian, and all classes are in Hungarian, and you already know 2 languages, and now you have to learn a 3rd if you're going to get by. And that's one of the first steps, right? How do you force and destroy the culture? You destroy their language. Then you destroy their understanding of their own traditions, right? And this happens almost everywhere. And of course, it starts with the idea that you're not really a person like I am. And this persists, right? Even though my great-grandmother, my Slovak great-grandmother, could not say Magyar or Hungarian without spitting, right? I mean, that's how much she hated the Hungarians. But she liked my mom, who was German and Hungarian. These are 2 groups of people my great-grandmother hated more than anything else. But she came to America and through her entire life, and she lived until the early 90s. You know, she was, you know, you couldn't, except for my mother, who was the one decent one she ever met, right? So this has persisted very long, and it's not just here, it's in Europe, and I think we're seeing a lot of these things being revived right now, politically, from these ideas.
It's not incredibly difficult for human beings to dehumanize other human beings. It's actually fairly simple, and you know, the xenophobic, you know, would be the word to use. Like, you're like me, you're not like me, and this is how we create community and also difference. And the rape of Nanking would be a good example of Japanese, Chinese atrocities during war. We fight so easily. I think sometimes it's harder for us to bring together, like what you're saying is to merge this and bring people together. But to separate and divide is easy. You don't have to be smart at all to do it. You don't. I mean, human beings are so good at it. It doesn't take anything. It's overcoming differences sometimes. I think that human beings sometimes struggle with.
How do we begin to, I guess, like come together? What would be our first step? The Beatles? Right?
Sing.
That is definitely beyond my pay grade. I don't know where to begin.
Well, I would say, I think we have a long way to go. And I looked up a quote, if I can find it here. This is from 2 weeks ago, Overland Park, Kansas. And this is from a political committee man who Facebook's one of his opponents that's from another party, and says, you and your comrades' stealth attack on blank is going to blow up in your leftist face. This is a neighborhood committeeman, right?
Wow.
And the real blank will remember what the scum blank tried to do to blank in November. And you, radical socialist, kickboxing, lesbian Indian, will be sent back packing to the reservation.
That's pretty cool.
I want to meet that one.
Maybe you can throw mommy in there. I mean, that's pretty cool.
Comrade. Yeah, comrades.
So I mean, one of the things that we have to do, we have to teach our children, first you have to like yourself. If you don't like yourself, you're going to not like anybody else. And that's, I mean, I see that a lot with kids on the playgrounds. Oh, you know, they fight, they infight, they get left out, they get their feelings hurt. You know, if you're not nice to me, that's not necessarily my problem, right? That's okay. I could go someplace else and not be around you. That's okay. But you then also have to teach your children differences are good, right? Difference is not bad. And all of this often comes down to, you don't look like me, you don't talk like me. Great. You don't look like me, tell me about yourself. You don't talk like me, can I learn something from you? Can we share language? But it's not often our instinct. But I think those are valuable things for us to teach each other and to teach future generations. There's a whole lot of talk about bullying in the world now, which is different than when I was growing up. And people are like, well, they weren't nice to me, they were bullying me. kids aren't always nice, but you know, but you know, what do you do when that happens? You say, don't talk to me that way. I like me, and let's talk. You know, then conversation is important, I think.
I was going to say, but how long are we going to continue talking?
Oh, I know.
I mean, it's bizarre, but I hear about all these people who actually are sitting adjacent or in the same room and they're texting. And they're grown-ups. They're not,
Right.
they're not children or teenagers.
So I think there's a second thing we need to do. We need as adults to have, but I suppose it begins with children, honesty. So the sort of integrity that allows you to look clearly at the past with respect to yourself and the stuff you care about. So lost cause mythology, right? The fact that this is still this is nuts, right? And it's hard to make progress if you're able to convincingly lie to yourself. Yes. Then evidence bounces.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing how resistant an ideology or worldview is to actual empirical evidence facing someone. And I think the scariest part is that there's all of this social science research and social psychology research that shows that you take a group of people, they have a belief, they are confronted with the fact that their belief cannot possibly be true, and they call it doubling down. They now believe their view more than ever because the evidence shows that they're wrong. And it's like, when I start hearing about that, I'm like, okay, so I don't know what the next trick in the bag is in terms of trying to help people look at the world and say, you know what, I might be wrong about something, and empirical evidence is going to be an important part of understanding that. It's not going to be, say, the sole solution, but it's going to be an important part of it, that you then find out that, no, that actually doesn't help, and it exacerbates the problem. And I don't know how to,
Cross the divide.
Yeah, I mean, if that tool's not working at all, I'm not sure what you reach into the bag and get out next.
But it's kind of interesting because to me, there's an issue of personal gain. Because there are some people who will do the doubling down, and I mean, there's some intrinsic thing that they get out of being right, and so they have to continue to believe that they're right, as opposed to the person who doesn't believe in climate change because it's not in their best financial interest to believe in climate change. So it's sort of like.
But I mean, some of it goes just so much to your core, your identity, and the studies that you're talking about is like, I don't believe in climate change, it's part of my identity. And so it's not that it's in my best interest or not, but I can't imagine that not being true. And so when you tell them climate change is happening and, we're in trouble, they get even more, like, just tied up with their identity and saying, no, that can't be true. You can, ice cold winter on them in October, and they're still not going to believe in climate change because, climates change. It's impossible sometimes to cross that divide. And then they're not speaking your language.
Well, yeah, but then what do we do with that? Right? I mean, do we really just cut those people out?
Can you allow them to be?
Right. I mean, there are.
I don't.
Well, I mean, here's moving forward, right? For your own well-being, surrounding yourself by people who are going to be antagonistic toward your worldview. It doesn't matter which side you're on. It's
Right.
going to be not good for your well-being.
Sure.
Right? But at the same time, to isolate yourself from people who don't share your view is to cut off an opportunity for growth.
Right.
Right? And so I don't know where the balance is.
Well, you can say other people don't think like I do, and that's okay.
I mean, one nice thing is coming from a very large family, so there's a lot of people in my own family who I disagree with. I can't get them out of my life. They're there. That helps, because I get other views, and I've changed plenty of my views over time. Other ones I haven't. Other ones I'm not willing to. you know, so.
But, I mean, sometimes we try to change, like, I mean, the whole history of medicine, right, is trying to change people. You know, like, so, I mean, you could be wrong and I could know that you're wrong, but it's okay if you're wrong. Like, why do I feel the need to change you? You know, or you could be right. You know, so, like with Native Americans, we want you to want money and guns and land, so let's acculturate you to think like us. Let's force you to think like us. And isn't the liberal conservative divide just the same thing? Is like, if we could take them all in and make them think like us, wouldn't it be a better world? No. I mean, isn't it the same?
Well, I mean, it's hard. It's really hard because one of the things that you find out, and I'm assuming that you've probably experienced this with anthropology, there's the Western view of the world has this interesting way of focusing on these two qualities, individualism and rationality. And those two ideals are not shared by other cultures. And in fact, one of the things you find in tribal cultures throughout the world is that individuals don't come before the group, right? In other words, you're self-defined and then you enter groups. It turns out that groups exist and your individuality is a possibility, but it's defined within it. And then sometimes you find out that rationality doesn't play nearly as much of a role, and it's replaced by things like caring and things like emotions and things like community and stuff like that. And so when you're coming at things where one worldview is individualistic and rational, another worldview that is non-rational and non-individualistic, trying to figure out how these things mesh. I mean, I love experiencing that to kind of like change things, but when you're talking about large groups of people who are just having problems communicating and then discovering their worldviews are metaphysically entirely different, I'm not sure how we move forward. And then, of course, when some of those things are lost through assimilation, right? How could they be regained?
And somewhat of a progressive narrative inherently in the question is this idea of moving forward, like there's some place that we have to go. But
I mean, that's a constant tension in Native communities, especially if your leadership is leaning toward, as it was for much of the 20th century. Well, okay, so they're right. We do need to adopt their form of government. We do need to have economic development. And, you know, these traditions we need to let fall by the wayside because they make us look backward. So we're still dealing with that and trying to recover from that.
So I think this question of how much diversity is proper and how do you heal too much diversity in at least commitments, yes? It has to begin with shared values. So there is no story, for example, philosophers like to tell a story about rationality. What is it to reason well? And the truth is, we have lots of theories about good reasoning. And they're great theories, but they're always in relative. So I can't tell you what it is to reason well unless you tell me what you care about. If you tell me what you care about, I can tell you a lot about how to reason well. But until you tell me what those aims are values. So if we begin from shared commitments, we can get to common policy, even if we have disagreement about what the optimal is. Nobody's going to get the optimal policy from their point of view, but we'll get some policy that's reasonable and acceptable from everybody's point of view because we have these shared values. If we don't have those shared values, it's hard to imagine commitment. So this is your the terminology. So somewhere between Bar Else and what was the one?
Ramen.
And ramen. Somewhere between there, right? You lose shared commitments, and when you lose those shared commitments, it's really hard to look what compromise with it. I mean, you over there and us over here, right? That's possible, right? But that won't do for a country, and won't do for a healthcare system, and it won't do for neighbors, right? So
can I I'm sorry. Can I interject for a minute? Do you mind if we please shift to taking questions from the audience members?
Absolutely.
It's getting a little late, and I see students that probably need some homework, get some homework done, right?
No, really? Homework?
So I think we've covered almost every topic under the sun so far, except maybe the sun. So you guys can ask whatever questions you want. Yeah, we're gonna say this. I'd even enjoy comments. Yeah.
Do you guys believe that the world is flat?
The world is flat? Absolutely not. I do not. Basic physics tells me that it is not.
But if physicists are lying to you.
Depends on the
I didn't say the
geometry you adopt.
physicists. Yeah, well, there is that. So, yeah, the Earth is not flat. It's also not perfectly round.
I really appreciate that you said the thing about shared values being foundation. That's what I've been trying to teach my one-on-one students in persuasion, that you have to start out with shared values and respect. And I think that you all were talking about that. How do you go forward from here when you got this polarization of opinion and commitment to some ideology? And I don't really know that, but I do know that my observation is that it's only possible in a tone of sort of humility and kindness, and that's really easy it's easy to lose, hard to maintain, but kindness and humbleness probably are the key for my conversations with my friends and family.
Well, one of the exhibits that we've done at the museum lately is a World War I exhibit. One of the questions that we've asked our visitors is, what are American values and what are our biggest challenges? Because it's a way to try to get at what is it that our shared values are and can we move forward. And when I look at the answers, let's say American values are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, just for instance, or diversity or whatever we're saying. If you look at the individual hot topics in American society, like abortion, we can all agree that we value life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but abortion is a topic that, depending on which side you're on, you will value life for the unborn child or value life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for the mother. And that's the reason that it's so complicated, is because we have shared values, we just don't know how those are playing out in that particular situation.
And that's the best case I know for the sort of work they pay us academics to do.
Yeah. Well,
it's all those conflicts.
Right. I ask my students all the time, right, if you were going to pick one value in America that we all agree upon, what is it? And it doesn't take long for them to say freedom. And then I point out to them that political action committees on every side all have freedom in their name. It doesn't matter if you're on the left, the right, the center, or anything else. And I said, so how could we all be moving toward freedom and yet still be so antagonistic toward each other? And then, of course, you discover that, you open up a nice little textbook in philosophy on freedom, and one of the things you quickly discover is there's about a dozen definitions that most of them are incompatible with all the other ones. And so while everybody believes in the value of freedom, nobody has any idea what it means. And so one of the first steps then is dealing with those ambiguities, helping people uncover what and express what those things, right? So that's where the 101 classes, right, can be very helpful in just trying to get people, okay, articulate what this means, articulate it conceptually, articulate it in terms of an example, in a lived experience, right, to try to get some of that commonality and understanding. Because at least if we get some understanding, it's like, well, that's not what I think freedom is. I don't think freedom means the government doesn't exist. I think freedom means something more like having the ability to follow my dreams, right, and not have contingent facts of the world get in the way when they don't have to be in the way. Those are two radically different ideas, but maybe if we can start talking about them and say, well, hey, those are different, but are there ways they can work together? Maybe that would be a start. But again, I'm speaking way above my pay grade on that.
Well, I agree with you that since the days of the Enlightenment and the founding fathers and everything, it was individuality and rationality, but I think over the last 10 years, maybe we've lost rationality on both sides.
I don't know what rationality, I used to study rationality in grad school, and I quit doing that because I couldn't make sense of what it was anymore.
I think it's relevant to ask the question is, you know, right now with the society that we are living in and are creating and have created, do we think that as Americans we're well? Are we healthy? Do we feel good? You know, and if the answer to that is yes, great, let's keep doing what we're doing. But if the answer to that is no, which I think we're seeing with a lot of crime and drug use and a lot of people turning to technology and checking out rather than checking in and being disconnected, then I think we need to look at that. I think our doctors need to look at that. I think our professors need to look at that. I think our politicians.
But we're still number one in terms of gross domestic product.
Well,
okay.
But I say that though because that's the measure that gets used, right? In social and political thought, one of the things that you discover is that there are these different ways of how do we measure well-being, and one of the ways it turns out that we measure it at the policy level is gross domestic product, which of course misses everything that you're trying to talk about, and that's a problem, right? How do we know that America is number one? Because we've got the best gross domestic product. Now, the fact that every other index that we look at, healthcare, education, right? Housing. We just dropped out of the top 20 in terms of democracies.
Education.
Right. You know, we look at infant mortality rates, maternal mortality rates. We are not number one in anything, and in a lot of this stuff, we've dropped out of the top 20. Do you guys know what the infant mortality rate is for this country? It's about 6, just a little under 6. Do you know where that ranks in the world? 58th. Yeah. We're at 58th. You know what the best country is? Japan. You know what its infant mortality rate is?
What?
2. 2. Right. So 6 kids die in this country before the age of 5. Right. For every 2 that die in Japan. That's the rate. Outrageous. 6 out of 1,000? I think it's 100,000. 6 out of 100,000.
But when you ask the people that I have giving this response to what an American value is, I can't tell you how many people say money.
Well, there was a question.
You guys were talking about if I think it was something to do with science, that if the humans lost their humanity or while they were doing science, wouldn't they be able to achieve a lot more with losing it? I mean, it seems like we're losing it already, regardless of what we do. So I mean, wouldn't we why not lose it? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, just why not lose our humanity to achieve something greater, like curing cancer and other things in that area?
So that is a great question. Right. It's really about priority of values. So when science goes awry, one of the ways it does, it says truth matters more than humanity. So I'm willing to sacrifice humans to achieve truth, right? And that's right. That's exactly what your question is.
Now we're back to the very first quote, right? You got so interested in wondering whether you could, you forgot to ask whether you should, right? And whether that, look, it's very, very easy with very little chemistry to realize how to make some really horrible concoctions. Now, you get into these issues with chemistry, especially, of what they call dual-use knowledge. Knowledge where, by knowing that piece of information, you can use it for good, or you can use it for bad. So, right, if you know certain things about chemistry, you can figure out that, you know what, I shouldn't mix these things I have in my house, right? At the same time, you can come up with this idea, if I mix these things up in my house, here are the things I can do with it. And the fear is that if we lose our humanity, that everyone's going to do the second thing. That, hey, let's find out how I can use this for my own purposes without worrying about it the real impacts elsewhere, right? And so I think that's where that's what the concern is, right? From our side up here, our concern is like, yeah, you're right. I'm worried that we're losing our humanity, right? Kind of on a regular daily basis, right? There's been great strides, but those positive strides in this area seem to also come with some losses over here. And we worry that if we lose all of our humanity, that we just go down that route.
It's a very specific way of losing humanity. If you put truth above humanity in general, what you're saying is I'm willing to treat other people as objects. Yeah? So for the stuff I care about, whether that's curing cancer or basic knowledge of the basic science, or becoming superhuman AI, uploaded consciousness, or whatever your post-human vision is, are you willing to treat other people as objects to get there? And as a general rule, the rest of us look dimly on people who are willing to use other people as objects. The idea being that there's something fundamentally, morally wrong about doing that, right? And sometimes medicine's blown it. In general, the aim of medicine is just the reverse, right? It's to cure cancer in order to make lives better, right? I don't know if that's an answer, but that's the...
So I do a lot of research with alternative clinics. So like one of the things I look at is the Black Panther Party, who has a whole set of alternative clinics. And one of the responses to when people start asking them, essentially, like, you're offering medicine by lay people, your medicine probably isn't as good, right, as the medicine that you could get somewhere else. And I don't remember who it is, but they basically responded, do you want a longer life or do you want a better life? That, curing cancer, those sorts of things are all things we want because it allows for a longer life with the assumption that longer living equals better living. But losing your humanity or, living a longer life at the expense of others, right, I think for most of us is not a better life. It's not a life worth living. So if you give up your humanity or if you give up these things, then what you're saying is living longer is the ideal. This is what we should all be striving for, instead of saying, I want a life that's full of all the things that make us people and that make us awesome. Love and art and happiness and all of these other things that, we might not be able to measure the same way as success, that sort of way of achieving a longer life or, finding an objective truth. But is that really what we should be aiming for in the first place? Does that make our lives any better?
Well, and the other thing, going way back to the very first question, the one that you asked me, right? Most of the people who work in this field, when they talk about post-humanism, one of the things they're talking about not giving up, right? What post-humanism doesn't mean is giving up the majority of the values that we currently have. It's actually starts with saying, look, these are really, really important human values. How do we enhance them, not how do we leave them behind? Right?
Program.
Well, and that, and there's a lot of assumptions built into, I always mispronounce Bostrom's name. How do you say it again? Is it Bostrom?
Nick.
Yeah, Nick Bostrom. Nick, yeah. Nick's got a very, very weirdly, from my reading, analog view of the world. Right? It's very mechanical. It's very analog, and so you can program things in, and the way I read him, it looks like that, and I worry about that because that's one of the ways that I find some tension in the few things I've read. It's like I worry that he's dehumanizing us, even though what he says explicitly is that that's not what he wants, but the way that he sets it up is going to cause there's an internal tension there, and
the boys are working on that, and girls are, it does leave the probability this whole trip is a simulation anyway, is what he's talking about.
Right.
The value of this stuff, when you're talking about the values, and like you hit on, like Sam Harris said, the cure for most all this is just giving honest answers to children.
Mm-hmm.
And if that can be, we're going to have to program in some of this stuff with artificial intelligence, or otherwise we'll have artificial machine learning that
this is actually, not very many people are watching it, but there's a television show called The Travelers that deals with that. I mean, this is kind of at the core of this science fiction story. It's a lot like the movie 12 Monkeys and the original movie that was based off of a French short called La Jetée. It's about time travel, and it turns out that there are all sorts of issues about artificial intelligence and human beings and groups of people who are like, wait a minute, we gave up too much stuff to the artificial intelligence to make the decisions for us, and it's not making human decisions anymore. And so that plays a big role in that. So you see those tensions in a lot of that stuff. And I mean, part of the reason I like science fiction is historically I grew up with it, but it really was a lot of it was the form of fiction that asked what if the most. What if this is what the next stage was like? What would that mean and how would that look? And it was a way to explore that, which is I've often found it interesting that people who do post-humanism, this idea that that we're about to go to this next stage of evolution, it's going to be kind of a big jump. I've always found it fascinating that they don't seem to reference science fiction more than they do. They're very focused on.
Oh, because Neil deGrasse is too much fun.
Oh, is that what it is?
It's a little after 7:30. I guess we'll have to try to wrap things up here. So, do you have any last comments from the panel?
I don't know that I have anything to say. I mean, I was going to follow up with what you were saying with the question, with this idea of post-humanism. I take it as what you're saying with another stage in evolution, that human beings are biologically within their brains going to be evolving in a big jump, and I think it's coming, let's say. I don't take the AI into account with that as much. Like, it's not a factor that I've ever thought about. Maybe you can use that for your answer. I mean, can human beings evolve without that artificial intelligence, without that technology? Maybe it's just time for us to make another step where we're a kinder, more understanding society. Because we've been mean and nasty long enough, or made enough mistakes. Is that a possibility?
I hope.
We don't look at the historian, because it's not very answered.
All historians are pessimists.
So maybe I'll switch ground just a little bit. So if you look at the history of medicine, it's done lots and lots and lots of good things. It's done some bad things too. It's a feature of the evolution, at least recently, that it's getting better. It's getting better in terms of the number of lives it saves. It's getting better in saving them more humanistically, right, with fewer transgressions of values, and it's becoming better distributed. So more people have better access to good care, and that's true not just within the U.S., it's true globally. It remains the case that the distribution of access to health care and the care itself is unacceptably uneven. And so as citizens, one of the things we ought to be paying attention to, so President Obama did great stuff with the ACA. That just gave lots of people more access to health care, but there's more to be done, and we ought to be watching it, see if we can't improve that distribution. My last 2 cents.
And I agree with that, except it's being rolled back bit by bit. And so I'm not even sure that more people have access to health care these days.
Temporary. So the U.S. story is complicated, but you think about HIV in Africa, yeah? So that maybe the one really good thing for public health that the Bush administration did, that made a real difference in global health, yeah? So its progress is uneven. The arc of justice.
Yes. So I guess before you go, if you have time to follow that little tiny URL to a post-panel survey. Also, we have some interesting artifacts from the Glore Psychiatric Museum. Come check them out. The most humane ways of treating psychiatric inmates, I'm sure.
Historically?
For the time.
If you guys ever get a chance, I'll plug it for you.
Please.
The Glore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joseph, which is a little over 40 minutes away. If you haven't been there,
It's awesome.
It's awesome. I mean, I'm trying to figure out the right term to use because you're not going to leave happy, right? But you are going to leave informed, and you're going to find out thought-provoking, and there's going to be things you see in there that you realize, wait a minute, that was when? And you realize it wasn't that long ago. And there's great stories about the first EKG machine they got. That was, I'm just going to leave you to discover that one. That's a great story.
Sarah, what did you bring today, just so they know what?
So I have the Hippocratic Oath. I thought that was important. First, do no harm. And then I have a straight jacket. That's one of our older Camisile style straight jackets that patients would actually make themselves out of mattress material, mattress ticking. We have some restraints. We have lots of restraints at the museum. I have a book on psychology, abnormal and normal. And I like to ask that question of what it means to be normal. I have a big blue pill. That's a little blue pill in real life, which I think just the relationship to pharmaceuticals is really important right now. I think it's something we should all pay attention to. If your doctor says take something, that doesn't mean you have to take it. Because we're seeing a lot of problems coming out of that. I have a Walter Friedman lobotomy toolkit, which is pretty amazing, and a book of patients, pictures of patients, which is another question that we discuss a lot is, you know, when I first went to the psychiatric museum, we had just pictures of doctors and nurses on the walls. You know, we have concerns about patient rights and people ogling at patients, but at the same time, I felt like a lot of the people who had been patients at the museum, their histories, their stories had been removed. And I asked the question whether or not removing their photographs from that history was also another form of erasing history. So we go back and forth and we say, well, we're not going to put their names or who they were, but at least having the images reminds us that it wasn't just a hospital full of doctors and nurses. They were there for the patients too. So I think that's perfect. So I've got some stuff to see.
So if you'd like to come up and check it out, you're more than welcome to do so. Just don't touch anything, okay? But you can definitely check it out.
Or if you want to just come down and say hi to anyone on our panel and have more questions for them, or give them money, they'd like that too. No, I'm good.
No, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for coming and sitting for all. And thank you guys for putting it together.
Thank you.
And if you're a student and need to do a sign-out sheet, they can get it for a sign-in sheet.
Very helpful, but no longer. Oh, so retired. Good for you. Good for you. What was the? Is it chronically underfunded? Is it chronically?
A little sad we never got to talk about Unit 731.
What?
So a little sad we never got to talk about Unit 731.